foxes came and they were interested in us, but the moment we turned, they got afraid and they ran off.
Yeah. They're probably interested because they wanted food, but most animals do.
I would think in the beginning, in the garden, there was no fear. The animals were like pets. So now it's going to be different.
It does appear that way, doesn't it? It does appear that the animals did not fear mankind previous to this. And man's been on the earth 1,600 years now, at least at this point. And there was no fear in animals of mankind. Now, there's probably a couple different ways you could look at it. Is it possible that God made animals afraid for the animals' benefit or for man's benefit? It could be both. You know, we're speculating here, but it could be for both. And what's interesting is, oh, I'm sorry, somebody?
Yeah, I have a hard time just definitively saying that the animals weren't afraid of mankind before. I think we need to be careful making definitive statements when the Bible doesn't give us that. Because you could say that, I mean, Adam was given dominion over them, so they would have known, okay, he has dominion over us, so maybe they wouldn't have tried to eat him. But I don't know. I don't like to say specifically it was a certain way when the Bible doesn't tell us that specifically.
Well, I think dominion can mean leadership, where fear, I think, is something a little bit different. And I think fear is a pretty specific word, where it seems like if God is performing this directive and declaring that he's going to make animals this way, obviously he's doing something that is different from the past, because obviously they couldn't have been that way before. So there's a couple different ways you could look at this. What's interesting too is, and Rick kind of mentioned it a little bit from the very beginning in the garden, and I started thinking about that a little bit too. If you turn over to Isaiah chapter 11, there's an interesting verse there. Isaiah chapter 11. And I don't know if this has relevance or not, but I found this verse interesting in that it's possibly a way of looking at this. In chapter 11 of Isaiah, verse 6. And this is kind of a famous section here. It's dealing with the future coming of the Messiah, who will be Jesus later in the future. And this is a prediction of that in the future. He says in verse 6, the wolf will lie with the lamb, the leper will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and the little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like an ox. The infant will play near the hole of a cobra, and the young child will put his hand into the viper's nest. And they will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the earth. And this is a future prediction referring to something in the future, dealing partly with the Messiah. But what does it tell you about here? Is this different than the way the world is right now? Oh boy. And you know, I've heard a lot of people talk about, you know, the lion will lie down with the lamb. It actually just says it's the wolf that lies down with the lamb. But obviously something's going to be really different with animals in the future. And whether there's animals in heaven or not, I have no idea, and I'm not going to even speculate about that. But it appears that there is a difference here that could have been the way it was in the very beginning, as Rick mentioned, in the Garden of Eden. Maybe there was no fear at all of animals and human beings. Notice it even said the lion will eat straw. And up to this point, we're going to see in the next verse where it talks about the eating of meat. Apparently, God never gave permission for man to eat meat up until this point, because that's in verse 3. He says, everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So that's a new directive also. Before this, it appears that man was not eating meat at this point. Now, there were sacrifices offered. There's going to be a sacrifice very shortly after this, or before this, and we know that Abel gave a sacrifice. Never says they ate of it, but they did do a sacrifice early on. But apparently it seems like there was no eating of meat at that point. Now, whether, there's a lot of debate about this, whether other human beings, aside from God's followers, were eating meat, we don't know. And it's possible they were. But apparently God did not want his chosen people to eat meat, at least at that point. And this clearly shows that he's going to change that at this point. So whether animals are different or not, it seems there's some degree of differences in mankind today. Now, is it true today? You mentioned one, but is this true of all animals being afraid of human beings?
No.
Okay, this is complicated.
Yeah, because there are some that just don't.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that a little bit too. Matter of fact, most animals that are afraid of human beings, and I've seen experts like in zoos and wildlife areas, what do they tell you when it concerns the animals? If you go into the woods, what will they tell you to do concerning the animals?
Don't run.
Don't run? That could be, yeah. What about animals? What are some of the things they tell us not to do?
Well, stay away from them.
Stay away from them.
Don't antagonize
Don't
them.
feed them. Why not feed them?
Because it changes their animal instincts for hunting.
Yeah, and it also makes them less afraid of us. If the animals are less afraid of us, most wild animals, unless they're real little, for the most part, can do us damage. Even a deer can kill you if they get mad enough for whatever reason, or if you attack them. So for the most part, you can see that the animal kingdom, in many respects, tends to avoid human beings. I've seen some incredible things where sometimes animals do not attack. I remember watching this nature show a couple months ago, where this guy was swimming with killer whales. And he was swimming all around with them, and they were feeding at the time, which you would think, oh, that's a dangerous place to be with killer whales while they're feeding. But this killer whale, because this guy had been hanging around these whales for a long time, one of the whales actually came up and gave him a piece of meat so he could eat it. And I thought, wow, now that's different. So animals, you got to be careful with them, obviously. For the most part, I think they are afraid of human beings, but there are exceptions. They say animals that are sick or starving sometimes will hurt humans. When you deal with animals like polar bears, tigers, and crocodiles, I think they do kind of come after us. And I don't think there's a whole lot of fear. Do you know what animal kills the most human beings? It is a trick question.
A human.
Huh? That's number 2. Human beings are number 2. What's number 1? And they're number 1 by far. It's not even close.
The animal?
When you hear it, you're going to go, what? Mosquitoes. 780,000 deaths per year are attributed to mosquitoes. Why?
Because of what?
Diseases.
The diseases they carry. Typhoid and all the other stuff and all that. They kill the most people. Humans are number 2. What do you think number 3 is?
I'm still sticking with dog.
It's the animal human beings are probably the most afraid of.
Nice.
Snakes. Well, not mice. No, it's snakes. Snakes is number 3. What's the most venomous animal in the world?
Snake.
Now, there's some debate about this.
Who's a frog?
Daddy long leg, but they can't bite.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I think I heard something about that, but they can't pierce your skin or
They
something.
can't pierce your skin, but they're the most toxic and poisonous.
Yeah.
Who can't pierce his?
What was it?
What
Daddy
animal?
long
Daddy
leg.
long legs.
What animal is the most venomous? Peter?
I heard it was a frog.
A what?
A frog.
Tree frogs.
I haven't heard that one. Because I did look this up on the internet. I was trying to find it, and I found several sources. There are several creatures that are extremely venomous, but they say the one that'll kill you the quickest, where it's almost impossible to get a cure for them in time because they kill you so quick.
Jellyfish?
Jellyfish.
Which
Box
kind?
jellies.
The
Box
box jellyfish.
Yeah. Australia.
Yeah. Those things are very small. They're clear. When they're in the water, you can't even see them. And when they hit you, oh boy, you know it.
20 minutes.
You're lucky if you can even get out of the water. They take you down that fast. So,
So much for Australia.
that's one place I don't ever want to visit. Just about everything in Australia can kill you.
7 out of the 10 deadliest things.
Yeah. Yeah, just about everything there is deadly. So,
I wanted to go to Australia until I read that. I'm out.
what animal has the most endurance in the world? I know, I'm really going off chart here. So. What animal has the most endurance? What animal can run down every other animal in the animal kingdom? Well, cheetahs are the fastest in miles per hour in a sprint,
Yeah, but now.
But they can't.
but I said endurance. This animal I'm talking about can run down a cheetah. It can run down a horse. What else did I have? There's horses.
A hippo.
Rhinoceros?
No, it was, where did I have it? There was one other one. Oh, wolves. They can run down wolves too. And you know wolves can run a long time.
Isn't it rhinoceros?
No. You aren't gonna believe it when you hear
Is
it.
it a hippo?
There might be one challenger to this contest.
Which is the hippo? No.
You aren't gonna believe it.
I said the polar bear.
The animal with the most endurance that can run down any animal given enough time
Gazelle?
is human beings.
Oh, really?
We can run down any animal in the world, they said with the exception of maybe ostriches. They can run forever too. Man can run down cheetahs, wolves, horses, you name it, we can run them down because human beings can literally run. And they have races all the time. They have 24-hour races. They never stop.
I wanna know why someone would do that.
Well, they have to do it in some
Some countries, yeah.
cultures because if they don't do it, they're gonna starve to death. They will, I know in Africa, that's some of your greatest marathoners in the world come from Africa. And it's because some of the tribes for centuries hunted animals this way and they would just run all day long until they got their prey.
They could pierce them with a spear or an arrow, and the animal's gonna take off, so they have to chase it down to see where it went.
Yeah.
Or
So-
else they won't get it. Somebody else will get it.
Yeah. So just, that's my little bit of tidbit off the cuff issues here.
Absolutely.
So, there's some debate about some of these things, but I still think it's interesting when we look at our relation to the animal world and how it's related here. But God does permit us now, at this point in history, to eat animals. But as we read on, there's going to be a proviso. Verse 4. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for the lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. Now, I kind of want to stop there. We are not allowed to eat something concerning meat. What is that? The blood. Now, is that even true in the New Testament? Are Christians allowed to eat blood? What does the New Testament say? That's a big issue in the book of Acts. Because it was an issue going from Jewish culture to Gentile culture. Because Jews did not eat blood. They have special processes that they go through to make sure all the blood is out of the meat that they eat.
Kosher.
To make it kosher. They actually, I think, put it in salt to suck it out.
And they actually, for kosher, they actually have to have the rabbi there, making sure that it's done properly.
Yeah. And God, and one thing I need to note too, all these 7 directives are still in effect today. From the beginning of time, God gave these 7 directives, and they're still in force today, every single one of these. Why does God not want us to eat blood? That's very strong in His Word. Throughout the history of the world.
Is it considered the life of the animal? Is it considered?
Absolutely. That is one of the phrases it uses, because in the blood of any human or animal is the life of that creature, whether it's man or animals. That's what God says. And even doctors today will tell you there's most certainly some truth to that remark. What else? What other reason why God would not want us to eat meat?
Blood.
I'm sorry, blood.
Christ's blood saves.
Christ's blood saves. It has tremendous spiritual implications. Life is in the blood, and the blood of Christ is what saves us. The blood is symbolic of the sacrifice of Christ. Peter?
So it's a change from when he was talking about animals, he's talking about physical life.
Yes,
When he's talking about Jesus, he's talking about spiritual life.
correct. Yes, so there's a spiritual connection to this blood issue. It's not the only issue, but there's several reasons why the symbolicness of life being in blood, there's a spiritual significance connecting us to Christ and His sacrifice on the cross. They also have discovered, it's not in the scriptures, but they've also discovered there's significant health reasons why we should not eat blood. Does anybody ever read anything on that? There is some scientific information on this too.
There's like bad things in the blood.
Yeah, like what?
There's bacterias and
Yeah.
E. coli and all sorts of stuff in the blood that will
Yeah,
kill you.
yeah. If
Simply.
whatever person or creature you're drinking the blood from, if they have any diseases, some of those can easily be transmitted to the recipient that's actually eating it. And that is a proven scientific fact. You do not want to do that. Your body is not geared to digest blood. Blood has a very high iron content in it. We do not have the enzymes in our stomach to even digest it properly. Bats do, though. They have the proper enzymes. Vampire bats, they've actually studied that and shown that it's true. So it's very dangerous for a lot of reasons. I mean, would you drink the blood of an HIV patient?
You shouldn't.
I mean, that's a pretty obvious one right there. You know, people don't even want to touch it, let alone drink it. Why does God have to make this a command? Is it an issue back then? Is it an issue today in our world today?
Yes. We have,
Evidently. He wouldn't have said it if there wasn't a reason for it.
we have friends that, you talk about the blood when they get a steak. I mean, they slap it on one side and slap it on the other, and it's just dripping. And it's like, I have to turn my head
Yeah.
because it's like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
And I think to myself, they could easily get sick from,
Yeah,
because it's just, I mean, it's really raw.
yeah. Eating raw anything is dangerous. I mean, as far as animal flesh is concerned, it's just dangerous. I remember I used to have a friend when I was a kid who used to eat raw hamburger.
Mm-hmm.
He'd make a hamburger sandwich with raw meat. And he was always trying to talk to me. He goes, "This is really good. Just put some mustard and salt and pepper on it. It's good."
Where's he
I
at?
took one bite and I spit it out. It was not good.
And then also, even as we travel, we have to be careful. I think, in Korea, they call it blood sausage. I think in England, blood pudding.
Yeah.
And it's basically coagulated blood
Yeah.
with spices.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that was going to be my next point. Other cultures around the world today do what she's talking about. Duck blood soup. Have you ever heard of that
Chanina.
before?
Chanina,
Yeah.
chocolate
So
soup.
there's a lot of cultures that don't go by the scriptures when it comes to this issue. And gee, you know, some of these countries that do this stuff, do they ever have issues with a lot of diseases there? Oh, yes, they do. It's probably because of stuff like this. Peter?
So when they sacrifice animals, the Jewish people, they would lay it over a rock and they slit its throat so the blood would drain.
Yes.
That's what my understanding is.
Yeah.
That was what they would do.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, in fairness though, for the Chanina, they do cook. They use a cup of it, but they do cook it. It's
Yeah.
not, I mean, if you're raised on it and they call it chocolate soup. I mean,
Oh,
that's how
that I
they
didn't
get,
know.
that's how they get the kids to eat it. My kids were
Oh.
Polish, so,
Yeah, if they knew where it came from.
I've
Well, the scriptures say
never
don't
eaten blood pudding.
pardon me?
I was saying, you know, I was thinking the scriptures say don't eat blood, so I'm not even eating it cooked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, because it still violates the spiritual principle of it. It's not just about the scientific disease issue. That's the third most important issue of it. There's other reasons why we shouldn't partake of it. Back in that time, there are stories that have been written about people in certain cultures and tribes and groups that sometimes when they would hunt animals, they would literally, and this even happens today. I have in my book here, and I'm not going to read it to you, but the commentator of that book actually saw people in recent times kill, or not kill an animal, but bring an animal down, and they literally started eating the animal before it was even dead. It was still moving. They were drinking its blood while the heart is still pumping.
Was it some kind of satanic?
No,
Really?
it was not it was American Indians actually. Which I thought, wow, you know, I've never heard of something. And there's other stuff they were doing. I'm not gonna tell you the rest because some of you might want to leave the class. So it's bad. And it's happened throughout the ages and times. Sometimes human beings are just absolute savages. They're like animals. And God does not want us to be like that. We are not savages. We have principles. God's laid these down, and He wants us to be above such acts as that too. There's also, in the same area in later on, there's two other issues to note too, as far as not eating blood. What else does it concerning animals? Is there any laws or restrictions about which kind of animals we can eat? This is a tricky one, a little bit.
Well, the Jewish people can't eat pork.
Yeah, they can't eat pork, and there's several restrictions about certain types of animals. We're not going to run through all of them now because that's Old Testament stuff, and you know, just like you weren't allowed to eat like a shrimp, you couldn't eat shrimp. There's many other types of animals you couldn't eat if they were scavengers. You weren't allowed to eat them.
So how do we know the difference between an Old Testament directive and a current directive? Because
Good point. Good question.
We moved away from that, we can eat pork and not worry about that.
I would direct you to Acts chapter 10. God makes it a point, because in the Old Testament, Law of Moses, it's very specific which animals they were allowed to eat, because at this point in Genesis, does God make any restrictions about which animals they can eat? No. Later on, through the law of Moses, there is restrictions. Then in Acts chapter 10, Peter has a conversation with Jesus before he goes to the house of Cornelius. And what does Jesus direct Peter to do? And actually, this isn't the first instance in the New Testament where mankind is told all meats are clean. In other words, they can go back to eating anything, any kind of meat that they want. But the blood restriction held on. That stayed in effect.
Yeah, but it's Romans 14 you're talking about
14.
later on. But in Acts 15, when James writes the letter to the Gentiles, basically, one of the directives is not to eat the blood, but my understanding is that's just out of respect for the Jewish people who are in that culture who've become Christians too. So that was a Romans 14 type situation.
Yeah. So we can see that God did change it in the new covenant, because Peter said, I will never eat anything unclean. And he was directing him to eat animals when he had that vision of animals that were unclean. He wouldn't do it. And finally he realized that God had declared them clean. So hopefully that answers your question there a little bit. So we also too in the Old Testament, there's another one that I thought was kind of interesting, is that we are told, the Jews were told they were not allowed to eat fat. No blood, you couldn't eat fat. The fat of the animals, you're not allowed to eat. And with common sense, that tells you that might not be a bad restriction. Because how many of us deliberately try to eat fat? I mean, it's considered disgusting. I mean, anytime I have a slice of meat.
On a steak, oh, I don't know.
I know some people like it because there's a lot of flavor in it. But anytime I get any meat, I always cut the fat off. I just find it gross. But some people like it. That's an Old Testament thing. Once again, it can't apply to Christians at this point, but it was something in the Old Testament. So
That's when you get one.
either way. So, all right. Any other questions or thoughts on this before we move from this directive? That's the third directive. Also, too, in verse 5. For your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each man too. I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man. So this is a directive that is still very much in force today, not only by the Christians, in the New Testament covenant, but also in our federal and state governments and national governments. And what's the directive here? What are we not to do? Kill.
Kill man.
Now, there's actually two words in the Hebrew language for killing. One of them is, there's Rattish, R-A-T-S-A-C-H. That means to murder, and that's the one that's in the Ten Commandments. There's another one, Harag, H-A-R-A-G. That means simply to put to death. That is not murder, it just means to put to death. So the context would probably tell you why someone was being put to death. So what is God's restriction on human beings? Remember, what was the reason he caused the flood in the first, one of the big reasons he caused the flood in the first place? What did he say?
Wickedness and wantonness.
Wickedness, but he specified one type of sin in particular more than once. Violence. God had it with the violence. People were killing, slaughtering, murdering one another, and he had it. That's one of the big reasons why he wiped out the whole earth, because they were just a bunch of animals.
But what you just quoted just before that, if a man murders another man, it's all in that one passage, because if that man murders another man, then that man needs to be put to death. So it's all encapsulated in that one
Yes, thank you.
directive anyway.
You're correct. So you can see both meanings there within that context, and it's in other places too. So it's an important thing to remember. Also, I'm going to read an article on the death penalty, because this is an issue today in American culture that comes up more frequently than it probably should, and for the wrong reasons sometimes. This article reads, the Old Testament law commanded the death penalty for various acts: murder, kidnapping, bestiality, adultery, homosexuality, being a false prophet, prostitution, rape, and several other crimes. There was a death penalty spoken by God for these crimes. God often showed mercy when the death penalty was due. David committed adultery and murder, yet God did not demand his life to be taken. Ultimately, every sin we commit should result in the death penalty, because the wages of sin is death. Thankfully, God demonstrates his love for us in not condemning us. When the Pharisees brought a woman who was caught in the act of adultery to Jesus and asked him if she should be stoned, Jesus replied, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. This should not be used to indicate that Jesus rejected capital punishment in all instances. Jesus was simply exposing the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. The Pharisees wanted to trick Jesus into breaking the Old Testament law. They did not truly care about the woman being stoned. Where was the man who was caught in adultery? God is the one who instituted capital punishment. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man's blood shall be shed. For the image of God he has made man. Jesus would support capital punishment in some instances. Jesus also demonstrated grace when capital punishment was due. The Apostle Paul definitely recognized the power of government to institute capital punishment where appropriate. Romans chapter 13 clearly states that. How should a Christian view the death penalty? First, we must remember that God has instituted capital punishment in his word. Therefore, it would be presumptuous of us to think we could institute a higher standard. God has the highest standard of any being. He is perfect. His standard applies not only to us, but to himself. Therefore, he loves to an infinite degree, and he has mercy to an infinite degree. We also see that he has wrath to an infinite degree, but is maintained in perfect balance. Second, we must recognize that God has given government the authority to determine when capital punishment is due. It is unbiblical to claim that God opposes the death penalty in all instances. Christians should never rejoice when the death penalty is employed, but at the same time, Christians should not fight against the government's right to execute the perpetrators of the most evil of crimes.
Just the way I've looked at it recently is that if a man commits a murder or one of those, then his life, whatever happens to him, whether he's executed or not, his life is forfeit. He's made his life forfeit. When you think about it, any sin, really, our lives are forfeit.
Yes, and it's only by the mercy and grace of God that we don't face judgment all the time. David's a real good example of that. And there's many other examples in scriptures where God clearly showed mercy when somebody committed a capital offense. And there's lots of instances of it. So we have to keep that in mind. Also, too, if you notice, too, you even talked about animals here. When we read this verse, he demanded accounting from every animal also, too, and from man. Let me give you an example. If a dog attacks a human being and kills him, what is the most common result for the dog? They put the dog down, and it's based on this same principle. Even in the Old Testament, it talks about if a bull gores a human being and kills the human being, and the bull had a habit of goring people, and the owner didn't restrain this animal enough to keep it from going after human beings, and it kills another human being, what happens to the owner of the bull?
It's put down, just
They get killed too. They're executed too for flagrant disregard for other human beings' lives. And God wants us to be responsible to everyone. If, in the United States too, if a mountain lion or a bear attacks somebody in the woods and kills them, what does our society do?
it's an all-out manhunt for it.
It's an all-out manhunt until they find the creature that did it, and they usually put them down. They even go after sharks who kill people or attack people in the water. They will hunt them down, and they can usually find them. There's actually a movie about this. Have any of you ever seen the movie Soul Surfer?
Is that the one where she got her arm cut?
Yes. You remember the girl's name? Bethany Hamilton. She's in the news all the time now. She became a world champion surfer with only one arm because a shark took her other arm off. And she's actually involved in a lot of Christian causes because she's a pretty strong Christian, and she's out there all the time testifying about God in various places. But they tracked that shark down that took her arm off, and they killed that shark. And that is a true story. So even animals are immune to this. Now, on the other hand, sometimes we can go to extremes with this too, where some people get a little touchy about this, and I understand why. When it comes to, especially when it comes to pets, there's a story in the news right now where a lady, Kristi Noem, who's a governor of one of the South Dakota or somewhere out west, had a dog 20 years ago. And this dog was given to her by another person because they couldn't train this dog. The dog was violent, attacked people, attacked livestock, and they gave it to Kristi Noem because she was an expert in dog training, and even she couldn't tame this dog, and it was attacking people and attacking animals and killing animals. So she took this animal out, this dog, I think the dog was only a year and a half old, and she shot it, killed it. And people are irate about her killing a dog that was attacking people and killing animals. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? I still remember when I was a kid, 60 years ago, one of our dogs bit me. My dad immediately took that dog out and out in the country and shot it, killed it. I think people sometimes get a little too crazy with their pets a little time sometimes, because I know some people say, oh, that dog won't ever bite anybody.
That's too.
Got teeth.
Don't trust them when they say that. Because a lot of times I know enough about, I love dogs, but I know enough about dogs, I can see whether a dog's friendly or not immediately. And I'm always cautious approaching any dog because of that, because you don't want to put yourself in a dangerous situation. So sometimes our society's a little sick. They even did an opinion poll one time on the street. They're interviewing people, and they asked people, if you saw in a river a dog and a man going down the river and they were drowning, which one would you save? A lot of people said the dog over the human being. And I said, are you kidding me? That shows you sometimes how people can get a little wacko.
There's a movement going on these days where some people say that, you know, those of us who eat meat, we're murderers and should go to prison for killing animals. I saw it because a fellow Christian who's a Facebook friend of mine, she started getting into this and was posting and commenting. You know how Facebook will show you. And so I remember she and we had a side conversation through Facebook Messenger where I showed her, you know, biblically, if you want to be a vegan, be a vegan. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can't deem it, you know, biblically sinful. You can't say it's sinful because someone else is eating meat. Yeah. You know.
They've even had a couple court cases where they made monkeys into citizens because they have rights just like every human being. I was watching Hallmark yesterday, and they had this story, these two dogs with these two older ladies got married. The dogs got married. And they were all excited about that, and the dogs are licking each other's faces after, they're kissing one another.
It's just not right, man. Why are you watching Hallmark?
My wife got me watching it.
He watches Hallmark. I just exposed you.
I like Hallmark.
So any government today that rejects the death penalty is really rejecting God. And any human being that rejects the death penalty, in principle, not saying there can't be mercy, because there certainly is times for mercy in many cases, but nonetheless, they're rejecting God, and it's foolishness to reject it. What has happened to our country recently, because people relaxing laws against violent individuals, and they let them out of jail in less than 24 hours, even after they beat up a cop,
We have more violence.
it's skyrocketed. If people don't see the result of that type of foolishness, they're blind. And probably deliberately so, they're deceiving themselves. So God has very important reasons for doing it. That's why he instituted the death penalty in the first place, because of the way the world went before that. He had to wipe out the whole world to get order again so that people could live decent lives again.
The same way raising a child. You know, if you set a rule, be home by 11, they come home at 11:15 and you don't discipline or correct, guess what? Next time, it's gonna be 12 or 1. I mean, you have to be consistent with.
I learned that the hard way with my dad.
My son did that once. They had curfew and he was with his younger brother, but the older one had a driver's license. And they were out with people and they didn't come home and I couldn't find them. So they finally called me and they said, well, we're at our aunt's house, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you need to get home here as fast as you can safely. And as soon as he walked in the door, my hand like this, I said, well, take those keys. And when I decide you're more mature, you'll get them back. He was
It starts